Each time Israel has agreed to a Palestinian state, the Palestinians have rejected the offer, often violently.
Palestinian people don't really seem interested in a peace. Seems like they're still interested in fighting.
The only time Yasser Arafat didn't tell me the truth was when he promised me he was going to accept the peace deal that we had worked out.
Maybe the answer is to pressure the Palestinians to finally accept the existence of a Jewish state.
They had a state in 1947. They rejected it. And then they repeated that same mistake over and over and over again.
Israel would dismantle the settlements for real peace in a moment because the Israeli people are much more interested in sending their kids to college and in having a peaceful life.
As the famous quote goes, the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
Let's get this out of the way up front. Israeli officials, whether right or left-wing, were never interested in a fair or reasonable peace settlement with the Palestinians. The goal was always the same: to legitimize and fortify the occupation of the Palestinians while continuing to colonize the land. The idea that Zionists wanted peace while Palestinians were driven only by violence and rejectionism isn't just ahistorical. It's one of the most pernicious lies told about this topic. This video was originally meant to be a segment in a larger video I'm working on where I debunk every Zionist talking point, but that video is getting a bit too long, so I thought I'd give you this one as a standalone while you wait. I'll be going over the main negotiations and supposed peace attempts between Israelis and Palestinians throughout the years, and showing you how every single one was not only unfair to the Palestinians, but also illustrative of the fact that Zionists never aspired to genuine peace in the first place. They only ever wanted control and domination. Let's jump back in time to the 1947 UN Partition Plan, General Assembly Resolution 181, which proposed splitting the land into a Jewish and a Palestinian state. This is viewed by many as one of the first main peace attempts between the indigenous Palestinians and the European Zionist settlers. To really understand the politics surrounding this partition plan, we need to look at the events that led up to it. Zionists had been settling and colonizing Palestine for decades by that point. They pushed Palestinians into economic subjugation, banned their labor and goods from the market, promoted exclusive Hebrew labor, bought up land, and evicted Palestinians from places they'd lived and worked for generations. So right from the jump, Palestinians had every right to reject any partition of their land, especially one as blatantly unfair as the 1947 UN Partition Plan, and we'll break down why exactly it was so unjust in a minute. Palestinians at the time rightfully viewed the Zionist settlers as hostile and invaders. To be sure, at first, the Palestinians were warm and hospitable to the Zionists, as is noted by historian Ilan Pappé, who wrote that the diaries of the early Zionist settlers are full of anecdotes illustrating how well received they were by the Palestinians. Pappé even explains how Palestinians offered the early Zionist settlers employment, shelter, and were open to working shoulder to shoulder with them, but that changed once the true nature of the Zionist cause became clear. As American biblical scholar Miller Burrows wrote, the opposition of the Arabs to the Zionists is based not only on economic and political, but also psychological grounds. The attitude of the Zionists toward the Arabs, at its worst, has been that of our Western frontiersmen who said that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. And at its best, the Zionist attitude to the Arabs had been patronizing and paternalistic. So let's take a detailed look at the 1947 Partition Plan and how exactly it was so unfair to the Palestinians. Right off the bat, its terms were incredibly imbalanced, favoring the Jewish minority at the direct expense of the Palestinian majority. In 1947, Jews constituted less than a third of Palestine's population and owned under 7% of its land. The UN's Partition Plan allocated 56% of Palestine to a proposed Jewish state, encompassing most fertile agricultural areas. The remaining 43%, much of it arid land, was designated for the Palestinian state. And that's not even mentioning the fact that Palestinians were precluded from having a strategic port on the Red Sea or a direct communication route with Syria, and much of the land that had been cultivated with wheat and fruit went to the Jewish state. The 1947 partition also created a massive demographic imbalance. The proposed Jewish state would include in it a large Palestinian population, about 45 to 47%. Of the 16 Palestinian districts, 9 were assigned to the Jewish state, even though only one of those had a Jewish majority, meaning a relatively small, recently arrived settler population that owned a tiny fraction of the land was suddenly granted more than half of it, and Palestinians were expected to accept that arrangement and in many cases, live under their rule. Clearly, the 47 Partition Plan favored the Jewish state. The Zionists, by contrasting their acceptance of this partition plan with the Palestinians' rightful rejection of it, were able to frame the Palestinians as unreasonable and uninterested in peace, a trope that remains to this day. However, even though the Zionists accepted this partition plan, they never intended to stop their conquest there. They had always planned to expand their territories and continue the ethnic cleansing and colonization of Palestine. The 47 Partition Plan just gave them the international legitimacy they needed at the time. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Zionist settler movement, openly admitted that his real goal was to take all of Palestine, and that accepting partition was just a way to get his foot in the door. See, back in 1937, there was actually an earlier attempt at partition between the Zionists and the Palestinians called the Peel Commission. This too was unfair to the Palestinians, proposing a forced partition that handed over much of the best, most economically valuable land to the Jewish minority, and this came after years of economic disenfranchisement forced onto the Palestinians by Zionist labor unions like the Histadrut. So the Zionists accepted this and the Palestinians refused it. But don't be fooled into thinking that the Zionists were acting as peaceful doves. They weren't. As private letters from David Ben-Gurion show, his acceptance of the Peel Commission was a strategic first step, and he never intended to refrain from further conquest of Palestinian land. He wrote to his son that his real goal was, quote, the possession of the land as a whole, and that by accepting the 1937 Peel Commission, his movement would gain international legitimacy and take the first step toward conquering all of Palestine. While addressing the Zionist executive in 1937, Ben-Gurion reiterated his ambitions and said his long-term goal was to, quote, abolish partition and expand to the whole of Palestine. This disingenuous first-step philosophy of the Zionists was an underlying motive for their acceptance of the later 1947 UN Partition Plan. The UN Partition Plan, by granting said veneer of legitimacy to the Zionist movement, gave them the, quote, green light to launch their long-contemplated and delayed conquest of such a state, as historian Walid Khalidi wrote. Khalidi argues that the international endorsement gave Zionist paramilitary groups the alibi to establish the new Jewish state by force of arms under the guise of conforming to the UN's will, and the historical record supports his claim. Empowered by the UN vote, Zionist forces swiftly intensified their attacks on Palestinian villages and urban areas in late 1947 and early 1948, before the end of the British Mandate and prior to the entry of any Arab armies into Palestine. In short, the 1947 Partition Plan was unfair to the Palestinians. The events that led up to it, as well as the specifics of the deal, make it more than reasonable for the Palestinians to reject such a plan. Another reason Palestinians and their advocates are framed as chronic rejectors of peace is their disapproval of how United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 was implemented, and even how it was written in the first place. A little context. UN Security Council Resolution 242, crafted by the US, was passed in the aftermath of the 1967 Six-Day War and introduced the idea of land for peace, where Israel would get peace and recognition in exchange for withdrawing from the territories it had just occupied. But right from the start, the resolution was deliberately vague. It didn't call for a withdrawal from all occupied territories, just territories, without specifying how many or which ones. The missing word "the" before the word territories in the English version of the resolution has been the most controversial part. Pro-Israel voices argue that this omission was intentional, meaning Israel wasn't required to pull out of all of the land it had seized, just some, depending on what it decided was necessary for its secure and recognized boundaries. Never mind the fact that the French version of the resolution does include the definite article and leaves no room for ambiguity. French is also an official UN language, and under UN rules, all language versions are equally authoritative. Nonetheless, Israel later capitalized on the vague English translation to maintain its occupation of conquered territories, with former Israeli Deputy Prime Minister Abba Eban stressing that his government would only consider the English text as binding. Lord Caradon, the British diplomat who helped draft the resolution, later admitted that this ambiguity was intentional. Israeli legal advisor Joel Singer argued that this kind of constructive ambiguity created a lasting loophole, one Israel has exploited to justify refusing full withdrawal from occupied territories. The most tangible consequence has been Israel's continued settlement expansion in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, claiming the final status of these areas remains subject to negotiation and that full withdrawal isn't required. As historian Rashid Khalidi put it, Security Council Resolution 242 linked any Israeli withdrawal to peace treaties with the Arab states and the establishment of secure frontiers. In practice, this meant that any withdrawals would be both conditional and delayed, given the Arab states' reluctance to engage in direct negotiations with Israel. By linking Israel's withdrawal from occupied territories to the creation of secure and recognized boundaries, Security Council Resolution 242 allowed for the possibility of enlarged Israeli borders to meet the criterion of security as determined by Israel. The ambiguous language of Security Council Resolution 242 left open another loophole for Israel to retain the territories it had just occupied. In the half-century since, with American help, Israel has driven a coach and horses through this linguistic gap, which has permitted it to colonize the occupied Palestinian and Syrian territories, some of which, East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, it has formally annexed, and to maintain its unending military control over them. But 242's problems go even deeper. It says absolutely nothing about Palestine or Palestinians. It reduces their entire struggle to a vague mention of a just settlement of the refugee problem, as if they're just an inconvenient humanitarian issue, not a displaced people with an internationally recognized right to return and a claim to their land. Rashid Khalidi calls this omission a third declaration of war on Palestinians, after the Balfour Declaration and the UN Partition Plan of 1947. By reframing the conflict as a territorial dispute between Israel and Arab states, 242 effectively erased Palestinians as a political community with national rights, all while masquerading as some sort of peace proposal and solution to the quote-unquote conflict. And to make things worse, 242 has become the benchmark for resolving the entire conflict. I put the word conflict in heavy quotations because typically that word implies two forces of equal might going at it. But what we see here is colonization and genocide of a defenseless people. The term doesn't seem all too applicable. Khalidi goes on to write that UN Security Council Resolution 242 erased Palestinians from the equation, framing the situation as a state-to-state issue between Israel and other Arab countries and legitimizing Israel's 1948 conquests, essentially helping bury the colonial roots of the antagonism between the Zionists and the Palestinians, and sidelining Palestinian rights under the guise of post-1967 diplomacy. By ignoring the refugee crisis and core issues from 1948, it handed Israel and the US a framework to isolate and deflect the Palestinian question altogether. Clearly, 242 is an obstacle to peace, not the harbinger of it. By shifting the conversation to only already existing states and secure borders while ignoring the rights of the people living under occupation, 242 laid the framework for future negotiations where Palestinian freedom was barely even treated as an afterthought, where they were offered token autonomy, while real sovereignty stayed off the table. The 1978 Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt are a perfect example. Based on the 242 framework of land for peace, Egypt acknowledged Israel, and in return, Israel stopped occupying Egyptian land in the Sinai Peninsula. Like UN Security Council Resolution 242, the 1978 Camp David Accords ignored Palestinian aspirations for statehood and national rights. Rather than proposing a Palestinian state, they merely offered full autonomy for the inhabitants of the West Bank and Gaza, without any promise of sovereignty or self-determination. As scholars Seth and Ziska put it, this approach stressed the concept of individual rights for Arab inhabitants of the occupied territories while precluding territorial control or the possibility of statehood. In preferring autonomy as an alternative to self-rule, Israeli diplomats sought to mitigate criticism of the occupation while simultaneously extending Israeli state sovereignty beyond the 1967 borders. But as Rashid Khalidi argued in reference to the 78 Camp David summit, there was no genuine autonomy being offered to the Palestinians to begin with. These provisions were stillborn, the Palestinian autonomy provisions, because at the Camp David summit, Prime Minister Begin had insisted against the objections of President Carter and President Sadat on denying the Palestinians self-determination or control over security or land or water or an end to Israeli settlement expansion. In other words, Begin was offering them autonomy without allowing them anything worthy in the name of autonomy. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin also refused to involve the Palestinians in any way in these talks, and the first framework, the one that dealt directly with the fate of the Palestinians, was written without the involvement of the Palestinians. The 1978 Camp David Accords were more or less an Israel and Egypt peace treaty. Furthermore, by normalizing relations between Israel and Egypt, a powerful Arab state, the Palestinian cause actually lost a valuable ally and negotiating chip due to these accords, setting the movement back. No wonder the Palestinians weren't happy. I hope you guys are picking up on this pattern by now. In many instances, the Palestinians aren't involved in these supposed peace attempts, yet they're still held responsible whenever they express their unhappiness with the situation. That's why it's incredibly dishonest for people to point to events like the 78 Camp David Accords as though they were some olive branch extended to the intransigent Palestinians, when in reality, the Palestinians were barely mentioned, let alone invited. A peace deal that works for Egypt does not automatically work for Palestinians. Arabs are not a monolith. Shortly after Camp David in 78, the Oslo peace process started. The Oslo Accords, the first of which being signed on the White House lawn in 1993, are often sold as a historic peace breakthrough, but are actually the peak of a long-running Israeli strategy to entrench control. Rather than ending the occupation, Oslo repackaged it, creating a system of indirect rule that looked like Palestinian self-governance but gave Israel tighter, more cost-effective control over the land and its people. Palestinian-American academic Edward Said famously called it the Palestinian Versailles, since it forced a colonized people negotiating from a position of weakness into an imbalanced deal. And that imbalance was clear from the start. Yasser Arafat, then leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, recognized Israel's right to exist in peace and security, accepted UN Security Council Resolution 242, and renounced violence, while Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin only acknowledged the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people, not their right to a state or self-determination. Oslo also brushed off core issues like the Palestinian right of return, kicking them down the road with no real plan to ever actually address them, just a vague promise to revisit things after the interim period. As Edward Said pointed out, the Accords were silent on the issue of Israeli settlement expansion, which, as he predicted, only accelerated during the so-called peace process. He also noted that the agreement was purposefully silent on how the interim phase would lead to a final settlement, leaving the door wide open for that temporary stage to drag on forever. Meanwhile, Israel effectively kept full military control over the Palestinian territories. If anything, Oslo made the occupation of the Palestinians cheaper and easier for Israel to manage by creating a collaborationist organization called the Palestinian Authority, or the PA, which was formed out of the PLO and tasked with doing the heavy lifting for Israel. From the start, the Palestinian Authority's main role, laid out in the Accords and pushed by both Israel and the US, was security. Said warned that the PLO was being turned into Israel's enforcer, with its security forces tasked on cracking down on any Palestinian resistance, whether violent or not, to the occupation and ongoing settlement expansion. The PA more or less gave a Palestinian face and a veneer of legitimacy to a system where Israel still held all the real power. In practice, Palestinian Authority security forces, often trained by the CIA, worked closely with Israeli forces, as analyst Tanya Reinhardt noted, including intelligence sharing and efforts to suppress opposition groups like Hamas. And the Oslo Accords did more than just create a proxy political authority. They reshaped the map of the West Bank, locking in a system of fragmentation and control that made a viable, sovereign Palestinian state nearly impossible. The second Oslo Accord, the one from 1995, carved the West Bank into three areas: Area A, B, and C. Area C made up 60% of the West Bank and was to be under full Israeli civil and security control. Area B made up 22% of the West Bank and was to be under Palestinian Authority civil control and joint Israeli security control. And Area A made up only 18% of the West Bank and was to be under Palestinian control. However, Israel still conducts illegal raids in Area A whenever they want. So even that tiny sliver, that tiny 18% that they get, they don't really get. This division broke the West Bank into a bunch of Palestinian enclaves, areas A and B. scattered within a continuous stretch of Israeli-controlled territory, Area C. It was a form of geographic gerrymandering that gave Palestinians administrative control over their population centers, but denied them authority over land, resources, and the territorial continuity needed for a viable state. Israeli-American anthropologist Jeff Halper describes this Oslo-induced shitshow in the West Bank as an intricate and interlocking series of control mechanisms that immobilizes the Palestinian population without the need for a constant Israeli military presence in the region. The key elements of control include settlements and settler-only roads that cut through the West Bank, linking Israeli areas while splitting up Palestinian ones. A maze of permits and planning rules keeping Palestinians from building or expanding, as well as walls, checkpoints, and roadblocks that turn Palestinian towns into isolated Bantustans, all while Israel controls the borders, water, airspace, resources, and Palestinians' freedom of movement. The logic behind this stems from the long-standing Israeli policy of establishing facts on the ground. The idea was simple. By flooding the West Bank with illegal settlements, Israel could create an undeniable material reality, and over time, that reality, despite being a blatant violation of international law, would be treated as a permanent, a fait accompli that the world would eventually just learn to live with. The core problem with the Oslo peace process, as Halper puts it, is that it confuses land with real independence. Israel can hand over nominal control of all the land it wants, but if what Halper refers to as the matrix of control stays in place, what you get isn't a true Palestinian state, it's a patchwork of powerless enclaves still under Israel's thumb. The truly insidious aspect of the Oslo peace process was that it swapped out the obvious signs of military occupation for a quieter, more bureaucratic system of oppression, all while drastically expanding Israel's illegal settlements. In the years 2000 and 2001, we saw another set of supposed peace attempts in the forms of another Camp David summit and the Taba talks in Egypt, predicated on the Clinton parameters, respectively. These negotiations took place between Yasser Arafat of the PLO, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and US President Bill Clinton. The mythology surrounding this era of peace negotiations goes like this. Ehud Barak made a very generous offer to the Palestinians at Camp David, but Yasser Arafat, due to his supposed love for violence over diplomacy, turned it down and destroyed any hope for peace. Then, Billy Clinton came out of nowhere and offered the Clinton parameters as a last-ditch effort to salvage peace. These parameters were super great and totally fair for the Palestinians, but they still irrationally rejected the proposal at Taba in Egypt. This, like every other Zionist talking point, is bullshit. This narrative of the missed opportunity has been used ever since to absolve Israel of responsibility for continuing to oppress the Palestinians. But if we take a look at what exactly was being offered to the Palestinians during this period and analyze the accounts of the negotiators and analysts who were part of the Camp David process, we see that Barak's supposedly generous offer wasn't a genuine path to Palestinian statehood, but rather a proposal for a fractured, non-sovereign Bantustan. Former Israeli Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben-Ami, who was a prominent actor in the Camp David peace negotiations of 2000, said himself that if he were Palestinian, he would have turned down the offer too. So let's start by taking a detailed look at the Camp David summit of 2000, then we'll examine the also unfair Clinton parameters which set the stage for the Taba talks in Egypt, which ultimately failed, not due to Palestinian intransigence, but mostly due to external political factors on the US and Israeli side. At Camp David in 2000, the quote-unquote generous offer made by Ehud Barak proposed Israel's withdrawal from 91% of the West Bank. But don't let that offer trick you. Israel was working with a dishonest definition of the West Bank, not the internationally recognized one. Israel's conception of the West Bank left out key areas like massive Israeli settlement blocks, post-67 East Jerusalem, which is 71 square kilometers, the no man's land near Latrun, which is 50 square kilometers, and the Dead Sea's territorial waters, which is 195 square kilometers. By shrinking the map of the West Bank before talks even started, the offer was already undercut. It meant a future Palestinian state on, at most, 86% of the West Bank, not 91%. The portion of land inside the West Bank that Israel intended to keep wasn't chosen at random. It contained the largest Israeli settlements, which were positioned to split the West Bank into several separate isolated areas. For Palestinians to travel between these areas, they would have to use special bypass roads built on land taken from them. Since Israel would control these roads, the Palestinian state would become a disconnected patchwork, unable to control its own travel and trade, which would ruin its chances of building an independent economy. And that's not even mentioning the unequal land swaps that Israel proposed. To make up for Israel taking what they dishonestly claimed was just 9% of the West Bank, Israel offered a land swap of just 1% of land within the Green Line, a lopsided 9-to-1 deal. And it wasn't just about numbers. The land Israel wanted to keep in the West Bank was fertile, sat on key water sources, and included strategic high ground. What they offered in return was mostly dry, degraded desert land in the Negev, far less economically valuable. The proposal said Israel would keep long-term security control over the Jordan Valley, which makes up the entire eastern border of the West Bank with Jordan. If Israel controlled it, the Palestinian state wouldn't have a real international border or control over its own crossings, leaving it effectively surrounded by Israel. On the topic of Jerusalem, the proposal gave Palestinians symbolic control over a few neighborhoods and religious sites, while locking in Israel's illegal settlements in the city. All in all, the Camp David proposals of 2000 envisioned a Palestinian state that would, in function, enjoy no sovereignty. The state was to be demilitarized with only a lightly armed police force for internal security. Israel would retain total control over Palestinian airspace and the electromagnetic spectrum, so things like internet, radio, satellite, etc. This overwhelming control would mean that Israel would basically have veto power over the Palestinian economy, trade, and any dealings with the outside world. Wow, such a generous offer. Just to be clear, international law deems transferring your civilian population into an occupied territory to be a breach of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention and a war crime. Ehud Barak's refusal to fully dismantle those settlements is in no way the fault of the Palestinians. His generous offer didn't even meet the very low bar of not doing war crimes. After the Camp David summit of 2000 ended in failure, Bill Clinton tried to salvage the peace attempts with his Clinton parameters. Now, to be clear, Billy was in no way interested in genuine peace or a fair settlement for the Palestinians. Even Aaron David Miller, a U.S. negotiator during Camp David, admitted that America, for far too long, has been biased and acted as Israel's lawyer. Clinton was more so concerned with trying to cement a legacy for himself before the end of his presidential term, not with bringing justice to the Palestinians. The Clinton parameters were verbally presented in December of 2000 in the wake of the Second Intifada and just prior to the end of Clinton's presidency. These were US-conceived bridging proposals meant to save the Camp David summit and lay the groundwork for a final deal. They weren't the result of joint negotiations, just America's idea of what a compromise might look like. However, they unfortunately failed to remedy the fundamental flaws that led to the failure of Camp David just months prior. Although the Clinton parameters were a bit more generous in regards to how much of their own land Palestinians were allotted in comparison to Camp David, and territorial continuity was given some lip service, Israel was still allowed to annex territory in which they had massive, illegal Israeli settlements. This would serve to legitimize those illegal settlements instead of abiding by international law and dismantling them. The parameters made it clear that Palestinians would have to give up their right of return to the homes and land they lost in 1948. In return, Israel would only acknowledge the moral and material suffering of the refugees, nothing more. The plan focused on resettling refugees in the new Palestinian state, keeping them in host countries like Lebanon or Syria, or sending them to other countries. Only a small number would be allowed to return to Israel itself, and even that would be entirely up to Israel. In effect, the Clinton parameters aimed to erase a right recognized in international law, specifically UN General Assembly Resolution 194, which states that the Palestinians who were ethnically cleansed in 1948 have a right to return to their homes and property, or, if they choose, be compensated for what they lost. Clinton wanted the Palestinians to forget about that in exchange for, what, a token gesture of sympathy? The Palestinian state outlined in the parameters was meant to be non-militarized, yet Israel would have the right to deploy its forces into designated areas of Palestinian territory during a vaguely defined national security emergency, as well as maintain 3 military intelligence gathering facilities in the West Bank, a clause that seriously undermined Palestinian sovereignty. Nonetheless, instead of outright rejection, Yasser Arafat, acting on behalf of the Palestinian side, agreed to consider these parameters with reservations. So when Hillary Clinton goes on Morning Joe and says that Arafat outright rejected this offer
was made, and if Yasser Arafat had accepted it, there would have been a Palestinian state now for about 24 years. It's one of the great tragedies of history that he was unable to say yes.
She's doing what she does best. Bullshitting. Arafat agreed to accept these parameters as a basis for further discussion, but he refused to waive the Palestinian right of return, among other things. The Israeli side also agreed to proceed with reservations of their own. Discussions surrounding the Clinton parameters took place in Taba, Egypt, between Israeli and Palestinian negotiation teams. However, due mostly to both the end of Clinton's presidency and Ehud Barak's prime ministership, the talks ended without an agreement. The narrative that emerged from this was largely the same familiar finger-pointing toward the Palestinians.
Arafat was the leader of the PLO and basically abandoned all the negotiations that made those things possible.
As if it were their fault for Taba and the Clinton parameters' failure. The common Zionist phrase, "there is no one to talk to about peace on the Palestinian side," began to make the rounds during this period in an attempt to place the blame solely on Arafat and the Palestinians. However, dishonesty of this statement aside, it leaves out all the times when Israel assassinated perfectly viable Palestinian candidates for peace, such as the secular, leftist poet Ghassan Kanafani, who is believed by many to have been able to lead the Palestinians to justice. Maybe the reason Zionists feel as though there isn't anyone to talk to on the Palestinian side is because they keep murdering them. Killing those sympathetic to the Palestinian cause is nothing new for Zionists. This is a practice that can be seen all the way back in 1948, when a member of the Zionist terror organization, the Stern Gang, assassinated UN-appointed mediator Count Folke Bernadotte for the crime of merely suggesting that the partition should allot more land to the Palestinians since they made up the vast majority of the population. In direct contrast to the Zionist narrative of barbarous, intransigent Arabs, historian Avi Shlaim, in his book The Iron Wall, actually makes the case for the opposite. He argues that it was Israel that was uninterested in peace, while Arab leaders were. The files of the Israeli Foreign Ministry burst at the seams with evidence of Arab peace feelers and Arab readiness to negotiate with Israel from September 1948 on. It's worth mentioning that just because we emphasize the need for peace, that doesn't mean we should forget about the pursuit of justice. Palestinians have been horribly wronged and deserve to be met with a just peace. Funnily enough, disgraced Zionist streamer Destiny has shown in the past that he understands peace without justice shouldn't be the end goal. When the topic switches from Palestine to Ukraine, then he's able to grasp that justice is what should be strived for, not peace on its own.
Peace is not really what anybody's looking for, and peace is a very naive thing. Like, there was peace in America when we, had slavery.
So first time I ever was actually listened to Destiny, and he said that people don't really want peace, they want justice. I nearly the single stoic Slavic tear fell from my eyes.
Ukraine should be supported for as long as they want to fight. Fuck Russia. You can't just invade other countries.
But when we switch the topic back to Palestine,
Palestinian people don't really seem interested in a peace. Seems like they're still interested in fighting.
I guess this is what happens when you don't stand for anything and just conform to whatever the political party of your choosing says at any given moment. I never hear Destiny or any other Zionist ever praise the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, which offered Israel what it claimed to have wanted all along: peace, recognition, and healthy, normal relations with the Arab states, all in exchange for Israel merely acting in accordance with international law, meaning full withdrawal of illegally occupied territories, accepting the establishment of a Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem, and respecting the Palestinians' internationally recognized right to return. Honestly, the Arab Peace Initiative reads as too much of a compromise for my liking, as it embraces a liberal Zionist stance and a two-state solution, yet Israel still outright rejected this offer. In the summer of 2020, the Abraham Accords were announced. These were a set of US-mediated agreements meant to normalize some diplomatic relations in the Middle East. Dishonest actors will act as though the Abraham Accords are yet another instance of Palestinian intransigence, since Palestinians and advocates for their plight disapproved of the deal. However, the Abraham Accords had little to do with Palestinians at all, and to even refer to these accords as some sort of genuine peace attempt is a joke. The issue with these accords is that they sidestepped the Palestinians altogether and tried to normalize Israel's relations with other Arab countries. This was effectively a middle finger to the Palestinians, as they were now watching other Arab countries who could potentially help fight for their cause normalizing relations with their oppressors. By isolating Palestinians even further on the world stage, the Abraham Accords, according to a member of the Central Committee of Fatah, was one of the reasons for October 7th. In conclusion, I hope I've made it abundantly clear that the peace process has been nothing but a sham from the jump. The fact is, Palestinians have been colonized by genocidal fanatics and then shamed for not accepting a partition that favors their colonizers. The only thing the peace process succeeded in doing was further entrenching the occupation and slapping some international legitimacy onto it. In my next 2 videos, I will be refuting every Zionist talking point. The first one will deal with historical myths and narratives surrounding the establishment of the State of Israel, lies such as Palestine was an empty land and things of that nature. Then in the next one, I'll tackle more contemporary narratives, so keep an eye out. Appreciate you for watching. Thanks to my supporters on Patreon, with a special written thanks to those top-tier patrons. If you're interested in the occasional extended, uncut video, access to my scripts, and work-in-progress updates, consider becoming a patron. Thanks.